All right, good morning. If you'd open your Bible to the book of Galatians, chapter 5. This morning we'll be in verses 13 to 15. And next week I plan, though always open to what the Spirit leads, to do a sermon on Christmas. And then the following week we have joint service. And so, and then after that we will jump into a passage I've been waiting to teach on about the Spirit. And the fruit of the Spirit and walking in the Spirit. And I always love to teach on the Holy Spirit because there's so much mystery around it. So really excited to teach on that. Galatians chapter 5, verses 13 to 15. The title of our sermon comes directly from the text, the command that Paul gives us and ultimately God gives us. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So let's read the text, open us in a word of prayer, and then we'll jump into the sermon this morning. So what Paul writes, for you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. Let's pray. Lord, I ask that this morning you would help us to take another step in the direction of loving our neighbor as ourselves, Lord. God, we confess to you how inadequate we feel to do this. And yet we also confess how adequate we believe you are to empower us and enable us to do this. So we ask, God, that you would provide what we need, knowing by faith that you will, to help us love our neighbor as ourselves. God, please help me to bring some clarity to this morning. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. I love myself. I do. I feed myself 3 times a day. Dessert once a day, sometimes twice. I work hard to make sure that I always have a roof over my head, clothes on my back, a bed to sleep in. I now have 2 pillows in my pillowcase, utilities for heat and water, a car to take me places. I take myself to the doctor when I'm sick. I watch TV when I want to relax. I play games when I want to have fun. I play basketball for exercise. I take showers when I'm dirty. I drink overpriced Starbucks drinks, eat overpriced Molly Moon ice cream. I fly on overpriced airline flights. I love myself. And so the command to love my neighbor as myself is not an easy one. It's not an easy one. But it is one that all who are in Christ Jesus will strive for. Why? Because there is someone that we love more than our neighbor. There is someone that we love more than ourselves. We will love our neighbors as ourselves because we love Jesus more than ourselves. That is why. Sermon this morning, I want to start off giving you the structure of the sermon this morning. I have 3 sections of 6s. Yes, I know that that's 666, but I didn't intend to do that. 3 sections of 6s, 6 verses of exposition, 6 disclaimers, and then 6 examples of Jesus. So that's where we're going this morning. 6 verses of exposition. I know there's not 6 verses in the text this morning. I'm going to break it down into 6 sections of exposition, 6 disclaimers, and then 6 examples of Jesus. So if you want to take that to mean I have 18 points, okay. 6 sections of exposition. Let's look at the text here. Verse 13a, Paul writes, for you were called to freedom, brothers. I'm going to stop right there. You were called to freedom, brothers. Now, I've already preached on 2 weeks on the topic of freedom. I've talked about it extensively, so I won't spend any time here on that topic, but you can find that online if you'd like to hear more about Christian freedom and so forth. But this verse 13, echoes what Paul wrote in verse 1. In verse 1, he said, "For freedom, Christ has set us free." And here he says, you were called to freedom. Same idea. Meaning Jesus died not only to set us free, but he died that we would live in that freedom. He died that we would exercise this freedom and live in it. And notice what Paul calls the church here. He calls them brothers. Brothers, or brothers and sisters. Even though many in the church are dangerously flirting with being severed from Christ, he still recognizes them as brothers and sisters in Christ. Verse 13b, "Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh." Do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. Here Paul highlights the intended purpose and goal of Christian freedom. And to do this, he gives two imperatives. The first imperative is, do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. Well, what does that mean? Well, a way to kind of think about this is there are two extremes when it comes to Christian freedom. We take the topic of Christian freedom, there's two extremes that we could be on. One way to think of it is legalism and lawlessness. The extreme of legalism, the extreme of lawlessness. Or you could think of it as the extreme of merited grace, which is a contradiction, or cheap grace, which is a contradiction. Grace is not cheap, right? So we see these extremes in the text in verse 1 and in verse 13. Verse 1, the yoke of slavery, that's legalism. That's the one extreme. And then in verse 13, the opportunity for the flesh, that would be lawlessness. Those are the extremes. If these extremes had a slogan, if there was somebody running a campaign to promote these extremes, this would be their slogan. This would be their t-shirt. Legalism, I need to do to be saved. That would be their slogan. Lawlessness, I am saved and therefore I don't need to do. That would be their slogan. Now, neither of those are true. Neither of those slogans are true. So, what does Paul mean by the phrase, though, opportunity for the flesh? NIV kind of gives us a better insight into this. He says, that they translate it, but do not use your freedom to indulge the sinful nature. Don't use your freedom to indulge the sinful nature. Well, what does that look like? Well, to give a couple examples, over the past 15 years that I've been a Christian, I've been around enough Christians, including myself, at times in my life, to see others and myself justify actions, to really justify just about anything. Meaning, I am free to go and gamble at the casino with my money. I'm free in Christ to do that. I'm free to go and have drinks with my friend, which you are, but we also consistently drink too much. But I'm free to drink. Or I'm free to go this far in dating. Or I'm free to isolate myself with TV or video games or internet. You see where I'm getting at this? As Christians, it's very easy to use Christian freedom as an opportunity for the flesh to justify anything if you want. And Paul says, don't do this. The reality is Satan can tempt us in either direction. We can use Christian freedom. Satan can take Christian freedom and use it to tempt us into a yoke of legalism. Meaning, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do this, you need to do that. Or to tempt us with a yoke of lawlessness. Well, you're free to do this, and you're free to do that, and you're free to do this, and you're free to do that. He can tempt us either way. The second imperative Paul gives in 13c, but through love serve one another. Jesus called us to freedom that we would serve one another through love. Now, the NRSV is the only translation that gives the full force here. They translate it, but through love become slaves to one another. Now, why did they translate it that way? Is that just, is that a good translation? It is. Here's why. There are other words Paul could have used for serve. This is not the only word for that could be used here. I'll give you an example. 1 Peter 4:10. As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another. The word that's used there, diakoneo, it's the verb form of the word diakonos, where we get the word deacon from. That's where we get our word deacon. But that's not the word that Paul uses here. He specifically uses the word douleo, which is the verb form of doulos, which is the word for slave. I think what Paul is getting at here in this verse is that, look, you can be a slave, I can be a slave of one of three things. We can be a slave of the law, which would be legalism. We can be a slave of the flesh, which would be lawlessness. Or we can be a slave of the body, not like the physical body, but the church body, which would be freedom. Freedom. Now, each of those is motivated by joy. Whatever you're a slave of, what motivates you to be a slave of that is joy. Legalism is motivated by prideful joy. Lawlessness is motivated by selfish joy. And freedom is motivated by loving joy. They're all motivated by joy. It's just a matter of what kind of joy. Christ set us free that we would find joy in becoming slaves of one another. Verse 14a. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word. I'll stop right there. The whole law is fulfilled in one word. What does Paul mean that the whole law is fulfilled in one word? 3 items need to be said here. Number 1, Paul is appealing to their desire to keep and obey the entire law. That's why he talks about it. The law is mentioned 32 times in the book of Galatians. 32 times Paul talks about the law in this short little book. Paul is saying, look, church, you want to keep the law. You want to obey the law. If you want to keep it and obey it, here's how you can do it. 2, when he says the whole, make sure you interpret that or read that as the whole horizontal side of the law. What do I mean by that? When we think of the law, the Old Testament law, it's very important that we think of the vertical and the horizontal. The vertical is that which is between us and God. The horizontal is between us and our neighbors. It's very important that when we read this, that we don't read it as both. He's only referring to the horizontal side of the law. How do we know that? We know this because Jesus said to us in Matthew 22:40, on these 2 commandments. What 2 commandments? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. So on those 2 commandments hang all the law and prophets. So when Paul says the whole law is fulfilled in one word, he means the whole horizontal law. Don't read that as the whole Old Testament is fulfilled in just this one command. That cannot be. All right, the whole horizontal. And then 3, what does it mean fulfilled? The whole law is fulfilled. And what does that word fulfilled mean? The NIV brings out the sense a little better here. NIV translates it, the entire law is summed up in a single command. To give an example, let me what does that mean? The whole law is summed up in it. Let me give an example here. Let's say that a new mom asks her husband to watch the baby for a day. All right? Let's say like several months from now, Jen's got to go out. She asks Patrick to watch their baby for the day. All right? There's 2 things that she could say. A, she could say, okay, Patrick, I need you to feed him in the morning, burp him, change his diaper, rock him to sleep, put him down for a nap, listen out for when he cries, give him a bath at night, etc., 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 right? Or she could say, could you take care of our baby tomorrow? Now, assuming the husband knows what is required in that statement, take care sums up all the instructions. In the same way, love your neighbor as yourself sums up everything God said. It sums up all the instructions that God had said. God said, look, Patrick, if you just take care of the baby, you'll be good, assuming you take care. Same way, if you just love your neighbor as yourself, you will be good. That will sum up everything I've told you. That's what Paul is getting at here. Verse 14b, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This command, and it is a command, comes from the Old Testament, Leviticus 19:18. But you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. This goes all the way back to Leviticus. This is where Jesus gets it from. This is where Paul gets it from. This command is repeated multiple times in Scripture. Jesus mentions it on 2 occasions. Remember, 2 different lawyers come to test him, and Jesus quotes this, Matthew 22 and Luke 10. Paul writes, for the commandments are summed up in a single word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And even James writes, if you really fulfill the royal law according to the Scriptures, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You are doing well. So, if somebody were to say, now that I'm a Christian, if somebody recently got saved, they get baptized, and like, okay, what should I be doing? I want to know, as a Christian, what should I be doing? What does a Christian do? What does a Christian feel? What does a Christian think? What can you sum it up? Can you give me the ultra Cliff Notes version of what should I do? Can you boil it down to something memorizable? Yes, God has boiled it down to 2 things. Number 1, love God with everything and above everything. And 2, love your neighbor as yourself. It's that simple. Of course, that leaves the question, what does that mean? How do I do that? And that'll be in the application. Verse 15. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. Why does Paul say that? Paul uses 3 terms here: bite, devour, and consume. What do those terms mean? Bite, this is the only time this word is used in the New Testament. It means to harm by biting, such as a snake biting you. That's how it's literally defined. Now, clearly here it's figurative, right? It's referring to an emotional or a social or even a spiritual biting of each other. Devour means to eat up ravenously. Again, this is clearly used figuratively. Jesus said, beware of the scribes. Why? They devour widows' houses. Consume, to do away with something completely by using it up, to destroy. This is the same word that James and John used. Remember, the sons of thunder tell Jesus when the Samaritans rejected them, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven and consume them? And Jesus rebukes them. No, I don't want you to do that. I think why does Paul write this? I think he is aware that when the letter that we're reading right now is read in the church, and they read this, the church probably is going to be sharply divided. I think he's aware of this. There's going to be those who support and believe Paul's position, the gospel of Jesus Christ, and then there's going to be those who support and believe the Judaizers' position, the gospel of works. And I think he's aware that the church may be divided when they read this letter. And verse 15 is a plea to both sides. Listen, guys, if you start a theological catfight using doctrine and theology as your claws, watch out. You might just devour each other. You might end up consuming each other. Now, before we get to the application of the text, how do we love our neighbor as ourselves? How do we do that? What does it mean to do that? That's our application. That's what we're trying to get at this morning. Before we get there, I want to make 6 disclaimers. 6 disclaimers. Why do I need to make 6 disclaimers? Well, recently somebody had asked a question in our series, Ask the Pastor on a Friday night. What's the most difficult doctrine to explain? You could say predestination, election, perseverance of the saints, justification, substitutionary atonement, hypostatic union of Christ, propitiation. Those are really not all that difficult to explain. The most difficult doctrine to explain is love. Love. Love is the most difficult doctrine to explain. That's why so many disclaimers are needed. So I have 6 for you before we look at what this means. And here they are. Number 1. Disclaimer number 1. No Christian can obey this command perfectly. I have heard many lost people say, you know what? You tell me you want me to be a Christian. Why would I be a Christian? You guys don't even love each other as yourselves. That's right. No Christian can obey this command perfectly. Christopher Hitchens, a known atheist, writes this: Christianity manages to pollute the central question, the word I just employed, the most important word of all, the word love, by making love compulsory, by saying you must love. You must love your neighbor as yourself. Something you actually can't do. You'll always fall short, so you can always be found guilty. Yes, Mr. Hitchens, that's the point. Yes. The very argument that the atheist would use to launch against Christianity is the very foundation upon which we stand. We are always guilty. Yes, that's the point. That's why we need Jesus. No Christian can obey this command perfectly. We follow and depend upon the one who did obey it perfectly. That's what Christianity is following and depending upon the one who did obey it perfectly. Guys, if you're on the fence about Christianity, and you're not sure if you want to commit to it because you look around and you see people saying, I don't see you guys loving all that much. You're absolutely right. Look to Jesus, though. He loved you perfectly. He does love you perfectly. 2, this command will not save us, even if obeyed perfectly. It will not save us. The world says, be a good person, be a kind person, be nice to others. That's really what life is about, right? Life is just about being, try your best, be a good person, be a kind person. And if you do that, you're doing well. And the reality is that even if we were the nicest, kindest person you had ever met in your entire life, if that was all we did, we'd still go to hell. There are unbelievably kind and nice and pleasant and compassionate people in hell. Because a massive salvific piece of the puzzle is missing. A massive salvific piece of the puzzle is missing, which is number 3. Loving your neighbor as yourself is the second greatest commandment, not the first, the second. A man came up to Jesus one day and he said, Teacher, which is the greatest commandment of the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your soul. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. When Christians say, love God, love people, that's not a bad slogan. If you have a t-shirt that says that, amen. I'm not trying to denigrate that at all, okay? But here's where I just want to be careful on this. Be careful that when we say love God, love people, we're not suggesting that they're tantamount, that they're equal, that they're of equal importance and value. They are not. Jesus himself says so. Love of people is not equal to love of God. Love of people is evidence of love of God. There's a big difference. 4, love your neighbor as yourself implies the reality of self-love, not necessarily the means. Let me say that again. Loving your neighbor as yourself implies the reality of self-love, not necessarily the means. What do I mean by that? Well, love your neighbor as yourself can cause us to love in some strange ways. It can cause you to love. Let me give you an example. Let's say that I don't like to be rebuked. I don't feel very loved when people rebuke me. And if that's true, I'm probably not going to rebuke you. I'll never rebuke you. Because the way I want to be loved is to not be rebuked. So I'm going to love you as I love myself. Or if I'm an extrovert or an introvert at heart. Extroverts and introverts like to be loved in very different ways. If I'm an extrovert, I'm going to love you by constantly asking you to hang out. And if I'm an introvert, I'm going to love you by never asking you to hang out. And these are both loving our neighbor as we want to be loved. But here's where this is so important. When Jesus says love your neighbor as yourself, he's not implying the means. He's not, love your neighbor as yourself is implying the reality of self-love, not the means, not necessarily the means. In other words, God is not suggesting that the means by which you would like to be loved is the means by which you should love others. Give an example. I like to be loved by having an orderly house. And so that's how I like to be loved. So I'm going to go organize your stuff. And I'm going to move it all around and organize it for you. That's how I'd like to be loved. Now that's not loving to my wife. That's me loving her as myself. You get the point that I'm making, right? Jesus is not saying love your neighbor as you. He's implying you do love yourself. Everybody loves themselves. People will say all the time, I don't really do a good job of loving myself. Yes, you do. Everybody loves themselves. Everybody seeks out their own happiness. When Jesus says love your neighbor as yourself, he's saying in the fact that you do love yourself in that same reality, not necessarily the means, love your neighbor as yourself. 5, the Bible is not teaching us that in order to love our neighbor, we must first love ourselves. I have heard that so many places and so many times. To love, I really need to develop a healthy self-love first before I can love you. I read one well-known pastor, you would know his name if I said it, who said, if you don't love yourself in the right way, you can't love your neighbor. Now, the reality is, that's a true or false statement depending on how you define the word right. Right. Normally, we think of right as self-esteem, how we see ourselves. We think about loving ourselves, and what does that mean? We think of self-love as the same as self-esteem. The problem is that the Bible doesn't really have a category for self-esteem. There is no category in the Bible for self-esteem. There's a category for self-denial. The Bible teaches God-esteem. God-esteem. It is only after having a proper view or esteem of God that we can then love our neighbor. If anything is a prerequisite to loving our neighbor as ourself, it is self-love through self-denial, not self-love through self-esteem. Having a better view of yourself will not cause you to love your neighbor better. It might actually have the opposite effect. 6, last disclaimer. In the command, love your neighbor as yourself, God defines the word love. God defines what is meant by the word love. God defines what is not meant. God defines what the intended goal is. God defines what the intended goal is not. We have to be so careful that we don't take a definition from the world or our family or our culture or our society or our ethnicity or anything and then superimpose that definition into the command. We must go to the source. We must go to God and His Word and ask God, God, when you told me to love my neighbor as myself, what did you mean by that? What did you mean, love? So what did He mean? How do we love our neighbor as ourselves? To answer this question, I want to look at 6 examples of Jesus. I don't really want to try to give you mine because I'm like, guys, I wouldn't know the first place to start how to tell you how to love somebody. I only know Jesus and that's it. I know my Savior and my God, and I only know to go to Him and ask Him. And so I want to look at 6 examples of Jesus. If the only person in the history of the human race has ever actually done this, there's only one person who has ever actually objectively loved their neighbor perfectly as themselves, and that was Jesus Christ. And if He's the only one who's ever done that, I want to look and see, what did He say? What did He do? How did He do this? And so with each of these, I'm going to give you 6 interactions of Jesus. This is not meant to be exhaustive, it's just 6. And with each of these interactions, I'm going to give you my main takeaway. All right, it's just my main takeaway. You might have different takeaways, and it's okay if you have different takeaways. My main takeaway from what it means to love our neighbor as ourselves. Here they are. Number 1, the interaction, the Good Samaritan, which is just a parable, but Jesus tells the parable. And here's the takeaway. Mercy, compassion, and empathy that moves us to action. What does it mean to love our neighbor as ourselves? It means mercy, compassion, and empathy that moves us to action. When a lawyer attempted to put Jesus to the test by asking Him, he came up to Him and he said, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" He was thinking he was putting Jesus to the test. Jesus was actually putting him to the test. Jesus tested him. Jesus said to the lawyer, "Well, how do you read the law?" And the lawyer answered his own question correctly. He said, "Love God with everything and love your neighbor as yourself." Now, he would have done well to just walk away. But the lawyer wants to justify himself. Luke says that the lawyer, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor? Is Jeffrey my neighbor?" Because if so, This in turn led to one of the most famous parables in the Bible. We even have a law named after it. Parable of the Good Samaritan. You guys know the parable, I'm sure, but just to summarize it, man's going down one day down a hill. He falls among some robbers. They beat him up, strip him of his possessions, leave him half dead. He's lying there on the road, bruised, beaten. Along comes a Levite, a man who follows the Lord, sees the man, passes by on the other side of the road. Next comes a priest, a man who follows God, sees the man, passes by on the other side of the road. Then along comes a Samaritan. And when the Samaritan saw the man, Luke says, and when he saw him, he had compassion. Compassion. What does it mean that he had compassion? What does that mean? There are many ways we can answer this question, but one way is this. Perhaps the Samaritan thought in his head, if I was that man, and I was lying there beaten and bruised and hurting and alone and helpless, and that man was me, what would I hope that man would do for me? What do I wish that man would do for me if the roles were reversed? The Samaritan binds up his wounds, puts him on his animal, takes him to the inn, pays the man, says he'll come back and pay him more. And Jesus asked the lawyer, who was a neighbor to the man? And the lawyer said, the one who showed him mercy. Now, it's a made-up story, so I guess it's fruitless to guess what were the priest and Levite thinking. I don't know. Perhaps they did feel some measure of mercy and compassion. Perhaps they did. They're like, oh, I feel bad for you, buddy, but I got to go to the temple. Perhaps they felt some measure of mercy and compassion, but not enough to move them to action. Not enough to actually move them to action. Loving our neighbors as ourselves is mercy, compassion, and empathy that moves us to action. 2, rich young ruler. And the principle, speak the truth in love. Speak the truth in love. You remember the story of the rich young ruler? Rich young ruler comes up to Jesus and he asks him, teacher, what good deed must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said, if you would enter life, keep the commandments. Which is interesting that Jesus says that. Like, isn't that works righteousness, Jesus? Keep the commandments. The ruler says, well, which ones? And Jesus answers with 5 of the 10 commandments. And he answers with the second greatest commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. And the ruler says, well, I've done all of these. I've kept all of these. And then he says something interesting. What do I still lack? He knew something was missing. What do I still lack? And Jesus says something to the rich young ruler that I'm sure felt like the most unloving thing he had ever heard in his life. Jesus says, go, sell everything you have and give it to the poor. And come and follow me. And you will have treasure in heaven. Now, Mark writes that when the ruler heard these words by Jesus, he was disheartened by the saying, and he went away sorrowful. Disheartened means shocked, stunned, appalled. He was appalled that Jesus would tell him to do this. He was sorrowful. It means distressed and in pain. Meaning this was probably the hardest thing he had ever heard in his life. No one had ever said something that felt so unloving. And yet Jesus said it out of love. How do we know that? Because before Jesus made the statement, Mark writes, and Jesus, looking at him, loved him, loved him, loved him. The world says that to love somebody, you need to affirm who they are. You need to support who they are. That's often what the world defines love is. Love is affirming other people. It's supporting them, like basically endorsing who they are, accepting who they are. That's what love is, no matter who or what they are. And that's not what Jesus does to the rich young ruler. He doesn't affirm who he is. He doesn't endorse who he is. He doesn't support who he is. Love is not affirming the other person. It's not. Love is affirming the truth in another person. Now, don't hear that say, when I say love is not affirming the other person, that means if somebody looks nice, that I can't be like, Pastor Matt said, love's not, you look nice today, but I'm not going to tell you because love's not affirming the other person. No, if she looks nice today, you look nice today. Love is not affirming the other person. Love is affirming the truth in another person. He did lack something. You would expect Jesus to say, you've kept all of these? Wow, that's great. It's so amazing that you've done this. Come follow me. I could use a rich man in my campaign. You're powerful, you're rich, you're young. This is what we want. Jesus says, no. Loving our neighbor as ourselves is speaking the truth in love. 3, remember the paralytic man? Principle, strive to meet spiritual needs and physical needs. One day Jesus is teaching in a house, and all the Pharisees and the teachers of law are sitting there. People who are physically well. But there's a paralytic. He's on a makeshift bed. His friends are carrying him. They bring him to Jesus. They try to get in the door, but they can't get in the door. All the healthy people are blocking him. So they come up with this ingenious plan. They climb up to the roof. They begin taking apart the roof. They get some ropes. They lower the man down. They lower him right in front of Jesus. Jesus looks at their faith. He sees the collective corporate faith of them. And Jesus says to the man, man, your sins are forgiven you. What? We didn't come here for forgiveness. We came here for... That's it. We're given every indication that Jesus is going to leave it at that. Your sins are forgiven. Pull them back up. Jesus had met the man's greatest need. The paralysis of his soul, not his legs. But the scribes accused Jesus of blaspheming. And so as a result, Jesus meets the man's physical need as well. He heals the man. He heals him of his paralysis. Loving our neighbor as ourselves is not to be a humanitarian nor a hypocrite. Humanitarian Christianity is Christianity that meets the physical needs of people without meeting their spiritual need. There's a lot of humanitarian Christianity out there. But hypocritical Christianity is meeting the spiritual needs of people without meeting their physical needs. There's a lot of hypocritical Christianity out there. Speaking of biting and devouring one another, sometimes these two camps of Christianity do that very thing. They bite and devour each other. Well, you're just a humanitarian. Well, you're a hypocrite. And they bite and devour each other. Paul says, watch out that you don't consume each other. Loving our neighbor as ourselves is to strive to meet spiritual needs and physical needs. 4, the disciples, humbly be a slave of one another. As we looked at earlier, when Paul wrote, through love serve one another, that can be translated, but through love become slaves to one another. Jesus said, whoever would be first among you must become slave of all. You know, at Christmas time, we celebrate the incarnation. I'm going to be teaching on that in a few weeks on Friday. God becoming man. Paul writes that Jesus, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave, and he was born as a human being. And it wasn't that Jesus took this position by merely becoming a man. It would have been enough for Jesus just to take on flesh, but he doesn't do that. He also lives the life of a humble slave all the way until his death. The day before Jesus was to give his life for the sins of the world, John writes, what is Jesus doing the day before he's about to do the greatest thing that's ever happened? Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. He rose from supper, laid aside his garments, took a towel, tied it around his waist, poured water in a basin, and he began to wash the disciples' feet, to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Jesus performed a task that was reserved for the lowest of society. The Jews often didn't even make their own Jewish slaves wash the feet. It was reserved for the Gentile slaves. Nobody asked Jesus to do this. He willingly takes it upon himself to be a slave to his brothers. Jesus is absolutely free to kick back and allow someone else to wash his feet. He has that right and that privilege. He's God. He's God. But he uses his freedom as an opportunity for humble service, not entitled privilege. Loving our neighbors as ourselves is to humbly serve one another through love. 5, the Samaritan woman. What does it mean to love our neighbor as ourselves? It means to see everyone as our neighbor. Remember when Jesus talked to the woman at the well in John 4? He was talking to the last person on earth that society would ever expect a Jewish righteous man to be talking with. She was the last person that you would ever expect a righteous Jewish male to talk with. Why? A, she was a woman. In those days, men did not talk with women in public. They just didn't. B, she was a Samaritan. Jews and Samaritans despised each other. C, she was a Samaritan woman. The Jews believed that Samaritan women were perpetually unclean. To get graphic, and I apologize, they believed that Samaritan women were perpetually menstruating, therefore making them perpetually unclean. That's what they believed. That's not true. That's what they believed. And D, she was immoral. She had been married 5 times and divorced 5 times. And she's currently living in immorality with her 6th man. So here is a immoral, adulterous, Samaritan woman. And Jesus loved her. He loved her. He loved her enough to engage her. He loved her enough to talk to her. He loved her enough to offer her hope. He loved her enough to tell her the truth. I mean, have you ever considered that when the lawyer asked the question, and who is my neighbor, there's a reason Jesus specifically tells the story where the Samaritan is the hero? It's a story. He could tell it any way he wanted. He purposely told it in a way that would make the one that they hated be the hero of the story. Why? He's undercutting their prejudice. He's undercutting their prejudice. Who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? My enemy is my neighbor. My boss is my neighbor. My friend who betrayed me is my neighbor. Donald Trump is my neighbor. The racist is my neighbor. Homosexuals are my neighbor. Drug addicts are my neighbor. Republicans are my neighbor. Democrats are my neighbor. Conservatives are my neighbor. Liberals are my neighbor. Foreigners are my neighbor. Loving my neighbor as myself is to see everyone as my neighbor. 6, last one. The Romans. Very simple. Forgive. What does it mean to love our neighbor as ourselves? It means to forgive. How could you love the very hands that were driving nails into your hands? How could you love the very mouth that was spitting onto your mouth? How could you love the very soul that was determined to destroy yours? And yet Jesus says, Father, forgive them. Brother and sister, you will never be asked to forgive anybody else, no matter how much they have hurt you, as much as Jesus forgave you. If you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. But love your enemies, and you will be sons of the Most High, for He is kind and He's kind to the ungrateful. You ever been kind to an ungrateful person? It's tough. He's kind to the ungrateful and the evil. To love our neighbor as ourselves means we're going to get hurt. You will. You step out there and you start loving your neighbor yourself, you will be hurt. You will be taken advantage of. You'll be slandered. You'll be misunderstood. You'll be made fun of. You'll be ridiculed, maybe even persecuted. Sometimes this hurt will even come from your family and friends, people you love dearly. And loving your neighbor as yourself means to forgive them. To forgive as Christ Jesus has forgave you.